Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Nantucket Historical Association's lecture series. My name is Jocelyn Wong, and I am the Director of Community Engagement here at the NHA. So, in just a few days, we will celebrate the opening of our special exhibition for 2025, Behind the Seams Clothing and Textiles on Nantucket. The exhibition presents over 150 objects from the NHA's clothing and textile collections, telling stories of making, meaning, and island identity from across Nantucket history. Tonight, our guest curator, Jennifer Nieling, will discuss the making of and inspirations for Behind the Seams. She will explain how the themes of making and meaning emerged through close examination of the clothing and textiles in the NHA's collection. From the materials, trade, and sewing techniques that produce them to what they can tell us about community identity and Nantucket history, Jennifer will share stories behind objects that made it into the exhibition and some that didn't. So, a little bit about our speaker today. Jennifer Nieling is an independent costume and textile specialist with a focus on costume exhibition and display. Her connection with the NHA goes back to 2015 when she inventoried the menswear collection and mounted the first of many costumes for NHA exhibition projects. In 2017, she led an IMLS-funded inventory and rehousing of the NHA's clothing and textile collection. Jennifer holds a Master's of Arts in Fashion and Textile Studies from the Fashion Institute of Technology and a bachelor's from Boston University. She has worked at a variety of institutions, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art and Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco. Through her business, JLN Costume Mounting LLC, Jennifer has mounted costumes for the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures, Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Science History Institute, Portland Art Museum, and more. She has published on the history of Nantucket looms and weaver Andy Oates and continues to pursue independent research. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer Nieling.
I think I'm on. There we go. Thank you, Jocelyn, for that introduction. So I am very excited to finally present this exhibition that has been many years in the making. It opens on Thursday. And as Jocelyn mentioned, my connection to the NHA goes back 10 years, which is really hard to believe now. I was actually an intern when I first inventoried that menswear collection. And the idea for this exhibition started about 8 years ago in 2017 when I was leading the textile inventory project here at the NHA. So I have to give credit to our chief curator, Michael Harrison, for having the foresight to give some attention to this collection. This is what it looked like when I first came as an intern. Everything in boxes. Wasn't super clear what was in all of the costume boxes, or if they were all digitized and in the database. So he brought me in as an intern that first summer in 2015, and I just started going through boxes and kind of seeing, what were the needs, what did we have, and basically prototyped the inventory process. And little did I know that a year and a half later, they would get this IMLS grant and bring me back to actually do the full inventory of the costume and textile collection. So this IMLS stewardship grant was specifically for this inventory, which involved examining and recataloging every costume and textile piece, rehousing them in archival storage with brand new compact shelving. And this was all with the goal of making the collection more accessible, both for use in exhibitions in the museum and for research for museum staff as well as just the general public. So everything at the end was cataloged and is now in the digital database, which is publicly available. And I also just want to mention that without IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, this exhibition and this inventory project wouldn't have been possible. And they are now at risk of being eliminated as an institution, and they really do really incredible work for museums and libraries. So with the help of seasonal interns, Meg Pearson and Ariana Bishop, and a volunteer, Robin Campbell, who was with us for a month, as well as some help from Elizabeth Gilbert, who's here today, as well as Pat Anathan, we went from what you see on the left to this brand new, beautiful, compact shelving, and more importantly, knowing everything that was in there and having it properly cataloged. So the process involved taking literally every piece out of its box, analyzing it, documenting it properly in the database with its approximate date, recording its condition, giving a physical description that included proper technical terminology related to clothing and textiles, and then digging into the archives a little bit. So we have all of these different systems on paper from when the institution started collecting in the 1890s, that not all of which at the time of this inventory were digitized. So it was a little bit of detective work sometimes, looking through the different record systems and making sure we knew who had donated these things, what's the history behind them, and then getting all of that into the digital database. And then finally, rehousing them in archival storage. So garments were padded out with archival tissue and typically stored in boxes. Quilts and flat textiles are rolled on tubes to prevent creases and wrinkles. We built custom storage mounts for many of the accessories. And through this inventory, I got to know the collection really well, since we were literally taking every piece out of its box and looking at it. And that's both in a broad sense of just what do we have in the collection, what are its strengths and weaknesses in terms of time periods that are better represented than others. Do we have more clothing than quilts? We have a lot of quilts, a lot of children's wear. But also on a more granular level, we were really doing close examination of these pieces, and you can learn so much by close looking. I'm a really big fan of object-based research, and what are these objects telling us? So we always knew we wanted to do an exhibition coming out of this inventory, and for me, it was always clear that the themes should come from the objects and what this collection is actually telling us about Nantucket and about its history. And I also wanted to show what a wide variety and what a kind of rich depth of subjects these objects can speak to. So I knew it wouldn't be a direct history of fashion, chronological kind of presentation. But the question was, with all of these different themes that these speak to, how do we create a cohesive story that can bring these all together and really show the variety of what this collection holds? And the jumping off point was really, what are we asking about these objects while we're inventorying them? So when are these pieces from? Where are they from? Are they from the island? Are they from abroad? What are they made out of? What can that tell us? How were they made? What is the construction telling us about these pieces? And the people behind them, who made them? Who used them? Who owned it? Why was it kept? These are all in a museum collection now, so someone had the foresight to hold on to these things, and why did these things matter to people? How were they used? Do we have any specific stories behind them? And then kind of looking at the broader stories of textile history and Nantucket history, what are the contexts that we can put these in? So eventually I realized that all of the answers to these questions, all of these stories that the objects were telling us, fell under kind of these umbrella terms of making and meaning. And that's really what we ended up using in the exhibition, the themes that all of these stories are under. And it isn't chronological per se, but there is definitely a chronological element, as in Nantucket history, you do see this shift from the whaling era into the 19th century, and then Nantucket's 20th century identity as it becomes a resort community, and then what it is today. So I'll give you an overview of these themes and some specific object stories, as well as some pieces that didn't make it into the show, and then a little peek behind the scenes of how we actually put the show on. So starting with making and thinking about materials and where those materials are coming from, the where was it from question was an interesting one because a lot of the pieces in this collection are from somewhere else. Nantucket, being a small island, was never able to produce all of the textiles for local needs, but they were very well connected through trade networks, of course, being a major hub of whaling in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we have many things from the China trade in particular, as well as other countries. We have one of these fans in the exhibition, but I just wanted to point out that these Chinese hand fans with peacock feathers, we have, I think, 7 in the collection. So these are major export items. And we also have a number of Chinese embroidered silk shawls. So China being known for its silk production for many, many years. And accessories also being kind of logical things to sell as export, as they didn't need to be fitted to the body. They could just be bought off the rack and used versus clothing that had to be custom fitted. So some of the silk shawls in our collection have interesting kind of ways they got here. There's one that came via Hawaii by a sailor. There was one that came via California during the gold rush era. This is the only red one, the one that we have in the show. The others are kind of off-white and beige tan colors, but this one is quite stunning, and it was owned by a local woman, Mrs. Judith J. Fish. So we have the things from afar, and then we have the things made on Nantucket. So in terms of fiber, everything was made of natural fibers until the 20th century. And what was actually produced here. So many of you may have heard there were sheep here. There was definitely wool being produced here. But what you may not know is there was also silk being produced here for a very brief time in the 1830s. This is part of a national trend in the 1830s where people started planting mulberry trees. So silk in the 1830s, all over the US, sericulture, the process of growing and processing silk, was popular. The mulberry tree is the only plant that silkworms eat, so there were mulberry trees planted all around island. And Atlantic Silk Company was started on Nantucket to process this silk and weave it, and then it was sent off island to Lynn, Massachusetts to be printed. And we're really fortunate to have in our collection some incredible rare pieces from this silk company. So the apron we were able to have conserved to be able to put it on display for this show. And this handkerchief on top is also on display. And I just had to add in, since we weren't able to include it, there's so many things and there's only so much space. But this giraffe handkerchief is just kind of a fun little side story, also by the Atlantic Silk Company. And we learned that this was a specific giraffe that was very popular in imagery around this time because Egypt had given a giraffe to the King of France and had this long journey to make it to France. And many people in Europe were seeing a giraffe for the first time. So it was this big giraffe mania. It was featured on all sorts of imagery. So also about France, but kind of going back to where things are coming from. So we have materials and products coming to the island from all around the world, but we also have cultural influence. And throughout the 19th century and beyond, Paris was the undisputed capital of fashion, and Nantucketers were definitely not oblivious to that fact. So some lucky islanders actually were able to get fashions directly from Paris, which I think was quite rare, and it's notable, literally, because they left notes with the descendants that these pieces were brought back from Paris. So it was considered, really, really special thing. The little girl's dress was brought to 5-year-old Ellen Mather by her aunt. And then this bodice, which also has a skirt that is now basically just a rectangle of fabric that could be then fitted to the person. When it came back to Nantucket, this was brought by Henry Coffin for his fiancée in the 1830s, along with a couple of pairs of silk stockings, which I don't think have ever been worn. They were considered too precious. So even if Nantucketer couldn't get fashion directly from Paris. They were definitely still being influenced by it. And in the 19th century, there was a big boom in periodicals and women's magazines. So women's magazines were spreading fashion plates, primarily coming from Paris and sometimes adapted in the US far and wide. So even if a woman wasn't getting fashion from Paris, she could have her dressmaker make something in the styles of Paris, or maybe even make it herself. And the dress that I had on the slide, which will come up again very soon, is not in the exhibition, unfortunately, because it has condition issues preventing that. But I just have to share it because I thought it was so cool. I found a fashion plate from a Parisian fashion magazine that looks extremely similar to the dress that we have in our collection from the bustle era in the 1880s. Okay, so this is the lovely bustle dress and the fashion plate. And you'll see that fashion plate as an image on the wall as a kind of a placeholder for the dress that we couldn't put in. So going from where is it from to how was it made, as we're cataloging these pieces, we're looking inside of all of the garments and seeing how it's constructed and what does this tell us. So when you're looking at seams, you can tell if it's machine sewn or hand sewn. And this is a significant thing, is the sewing machine came into use in the mid-19th century. And if you see machine sewn seams, then it can't be from before the sewing machine, or at least that seam itself. It may have been altered. So, helping with dating things, but also just seeing that there was really thoughtful construction put into all of these things. So this dress, I love this example because it has both machine and hand sewing visible inside. A lot of sewing still had to be hand finished, even once the machine came around. It's from right around that time when the sewing machine came into greater usage. But you also see, when you're looking really closely at the seams, that they're using their fabric really carefully. And it was common practice in wide skirts like this to have them made out of full panels as they come off the loom, selvage to selvage, sewn together. That was common practice, so you're not wasting any fabric there. And then also often seeing piecing, so seeing smaller pieces of that same fabric being sewn together where the seam wouldn't be necessary, but where they were sewing it together to make a bigger piece to create that sleeve. And then this one as well, just getting the stripes in very specific spots. There's very clearly some thought that put into this. But thinking about those techniques and that fabric usage was really interesting. We had many, many pieces in the collection that have been altered. I would say it's probably the majority of them have been altered in some way. And this piece is not in the show, but it's just a really great visual representation of what this can look like. So it was quite common to alter a skirt as fashions changed, or as your size changes, right? But as fashions changed, the volume being distributed in different ways to keep up with the latest trends. That was quite easy to do when a skirt was constructed in this way, and then you could even potentially create a new bodice to go with the same skirt that has been altered. And this hem also shows indications of having changed a number of times. So another great example that you will see in the show of alterations, this bodice here has, again, hand and machine sewing, and you can see the sleeves have been taken off, so whether they were going to be refashioned and put back on or used for something else. And this is displayed with an accompanying bodice made of the same fabric from the same house collection from Nanny Wood. So, we can speculate, was she making another bodice to keep up with fashions and wear with the same skirt? Was she changing sizes? This green kind of olive fabric was definitely added on afterwards. You can tell from the construction. And then there are all sorts of other kind of reduce, reuse, recycle things that you see. So mending, fixing something so you can continue to use it rather than throwing it out and getting a new one. I don't know if you could see, the stitching on this little child's shirt. We have pieces that were upcycled, one garment into another, especially with shawls, since they're a huge expanse of fabric that's easy to reuse. So this broader idea of sustainable practices, or what we would now call sustainable practices, and what used to just be, practical valuing of these expensive kind of labor and material-intensive materials, we saw throughout the collection and really wanted to highlight that. So in the show, we have our making and meaning themes, but then scattered all throughout, we have sustainability spotlights pointing out specific objects where these themes come through. So whenever you see a green label up there, that's what that is, and I encourage you to really do some close looking at these objects. So continuing with the sustainability theme, but on the quilt side of things, these also not in the show. There should just be a quilt show at some point, but I had to get them in here just so you can see. The one on the left, this is actually the back of the quilt. The front is a 19th century patchwork design, but the back is made of two 18th century fabrics, the middle one being an Indian hand-painted palampore with this tree of life motif and toile fabric around the edges. So really fascinating to turn that flip that quilt over and see these older materials being used as a quilt backing. And then the other one has some interesting geometries happening, and that's because it's been chopped up and sewn back together. So you see these motifs that look like they should be a border, and that's because they would have been a border. And I don't know what happened to the original piece, but it's some really beautiful fabric that has been refigured into a new, smaller quilt. And then the one that we do have in the show, again, material reuse, but instead of fabric, it's playing cards and old letters, and I think writing practice, because some of these, it's just the same letter over and over. Someone was learning how to write cursive, that were used as the paper for the templates for this paper piecing technique on this quilt. Take a close look at that upstairs. So moving from making techniques into meaning, these textiles can also tell us about the people who were involved, right, and who made them, who used them, and this is one of my favorite examples of that. This friendship quilt was made by 8 Nantucket women, and they have all signed their names on that central star. So this was originally cataloged as Nantucket quilt made by Nantucket women, and I looked into the Barney Genealogical Database, which is this amazing resource we have, at the family trees of these women, and was able to find out that the 3 women with the same, or 3 of the women with the same last name weren't sisters. They were actually sisters-in-law and had married 3 brothers from the same family. And then another 3 of the women featured on this quilt were grandmother, mother, and granddaughter. So it was really exciting to be able to find those connections and imagine these women, coming together to make this as a social activity, and now we have this object as kind of a representation of those social connections. So another kind of meaning theme, life events. Every historic collection has many, many, many wedding dresses. And why do we have so many wedding dresses? Because they mean something to people, right? They have this emotional weight, this significance, and they're often passed down in families. So we chose 2 wedding dresses from 101 years apart to represent this long tradition of brides on Nantucket. The 1871 was worn by Amelia Sanford, whose father was a merchant and benefactor of Nantucket, and she was married on her birthday. And then the one from 1971 was worn by Patricia Anathan, who got married over Memorial Day weekend with a clam bake and tandem biking, and had to wear her mother-in-law's Nantucket Looms shawl because it was very chilly that year. And I also just want to point out, even though we couldn't fit it in the show, that we do have some men's wedding-related garments. Of course, the women's wedding dresses are usually the ones that are saved, but we have a handful of really beautiful men's wedding waistcoats. This one was worn by Barzillai R. Cottle. So this theme of life events isn't just weddings. We also have many christening gowns in the collection, probably more christening gowns than wedding gowns, and baby caps, so things related to birth and infancy. And then it comes full circle with textiles related to death, so mourning embroideries, pieces that are commemorating the deaths of loved ones. So we try to kind of give that full circle view of garments and how clothing and textiles can hold meaning for people. The other way that these have meaning, telling us about the people who wore them, is through clothing that's worn for specific groups that indicate your social connections. So like the Boy Scouts wearing specific uniforms, and these were worn by John and Ellen Gilbert in the 70s, and of course have patches that indicate, the activities that they did and the troop number that they're a member of. In the show, we also have uniforms, so these kind of more formal, specific ways of indicating roles and rank. And then also indicating religious or political views. So this pair of dresses is one of my favorites. The one on the left is an example of typical Quaker drab clothing. So they wore very simple, muted colors, not any decoration, and you really, if you wore something too ostentatious or too showy, you could get excommunicated from your faith. So this is, really indicating this identity. And then this floral dress is worn by a woman who had been a Quaker. According to the accession book, she was written out of meeting, which means she was excommunicated. She may have left willingly. We're not 100% sure, but what we do know is that she wore this floral dress, which is very much not in keeping with the Quaker styles. So displaying these together really shows that shift in identity. And we also have a little miniature portrait of her from about a decade earlier than the dress, where she is wearing traditional Quaker clothing and has a really crazy 1830s hairstyle. So if you look close enough, you can see that as well. And then just sort of a behind-the-scenes little tidbit about this green dress. So we also had this piece conserved to be able to put on display. If it has been displayed before, it's before we have any photographic record of it that we know of. It hasn't been displayed in probably at least 50 years. But when I put it on the dress form and started padding it out to make it fit, I realized, I think this was worn by a pregnant woman. And when you have it laying down on a table and the conservator's working on it, you don't really see that. But once you put it on the dress form, you see that shape. So here's some, you'll only see her from the back in the exhibition, but here you can see that waistline that indicates that she was probably pregnant when she wore this. So moving into the 20th century, we're combining our themes of making and meaning. You really start to see clothing and textiles that are showing this shift in the identity of the island itself, and Nantucket looking back on its whaling past and sort of defining modern Nantucket through that history. And one of the ways that island communities did this was through the Nantucket Main Street Fetes, which started in the 1920s as a fundraiser for the hospital. And people would dress up in historic clothing that some of them, they just found it in their attic. It was their family's old clothes. And sometimes, especially in later years, reproduction, historic, whether it was 100% accurate or not, historic style clothing. And then there would be Main Street Parade and vignettes and different activities, and costume, played a big part in this. And I was very excited to find that this jacket that was worn by Austin Strong, who was a major community organizer, an actor, who was really a leader in these Main Street Fete parades, wore this jacket that I discovered, thanks to more of these records being digitized, was actually this blue wool jacket that had been separated from its record. It was just a really great blue wool jacket that I would hope to include in the exhibition anyways, as a representation of wool. But it's actually the jacket that he's wearing, and we were able to compare the photos and see. So you'll have to go to the exhibition to see that in person. So the fete was revived several times throughout the 20s and 30s, and then again periodically in the 20th century for specific landmark years. So one of those years is 1959, Nantucket's 300th birthday, and this quilt was made to commemorate that, and I think it's just such an incredible example of this specific island imagery and these iconic motifs that in the 20th century and till today have really come to define the island and identify Nantucket. So we have landmarks, buildings. You can see the old mill is on here and several other of the historic buildings in town. Mariah Mitchell is represented here. There's a Quaker, there are sheep. There's local flora and fauna, so really specific plants that you recognize on island. And still reflects the island as much today as it did in 1959. One of the major moments when you see this Nantucket being defined by its past and really leaning into that and its modern identities in the 1960s, when Walter Beinecke was buying up a lot of the waterfront and doing renovations he's quoted as saying that he wanted Nantucket to be like colonial Williamsburg. So really preserving that whaling era look and selling that history as a destination, right? So one of the big projects that was part of this was the renovation of the Jared Coffin House, which is just right up the street here. I'm sure many of you know it, or all of you should know it. And it was a whaling mansion that was transformed into a hotel. It was already a hotel, the Ocean House, when this project happened. But in the 1960s, there was an effort to redecorate the interiors with historic reproduction fabrics. And this was led by Marianne Beinecke and Andy Oates, who set up a weaving workshop. And we are extremely fortunate that right at the end of my inventory project, Julie Beinecke Stackpole, the daughter of Marianne Beinecke, donated this very large collection of textiles and clothing and related ephemera related to the Jared Coffin House, the start of Nantucket Looms, the Cloth Company of Nantucket, and the Nantucket Needlewomen. And we're excited to finally be able to display many of those in this exhibition. So this Jared Coffin House project, you can see on the left a page of the sample book that shows some of the historic reproduction textiles they were making. And this also included an embroidery project as well that you can see in the exhibition. And then on the right, there is a modern textile. So they were already, by the time this project was done, trying to make this into a commercial venture and market both historic reproductions and modern textiles. And then this weaving workshop became Nantucket Looms, which still continues today. So this is one of the very early promotional pamphlets of Nantucket Looms. And then we get this really bright, exciting kind of blip in history that is just so cool, and I'm sure some of you recognize some of these prints. So Nantucket Looms started. They were making woven fabrics, and then as they wanted to expand this kind of textile-related craft industry, they brought in Leslie and Dee Dee Tillett, who were already established print designers based in New York and had pieces shown at the Museum of Modern Art. Jackie Kennedy loved their fabrics. And they came here, and there was just this explosion of activity of this custom Nantucket-related line of printed fabrics, and this is just a small sampling of them. So they actually went on a excursion with a local horticulturist to see Nantucket wildflowers. So all the wildflowers on this print are actually from here. They're not just made up. Nantucket cranberries being local, of course, the whaling history, and actual objects from the Whaling Museum were some of their inspirations. So I was really excited to be able to match up the pieces of scrimshaw in our collection, in the collection here at this museum, that were the source material for this printed scarf that Leslie and Dee Dee Tillett designed. So you'll see that on display in the exhibition as well. So this Cloth Company of Nantucket, it became the Cloth Company as a new umbrella company when the Tilletts arrived. That Nantucket Looms they were still making wovens and selling those under the Cloth Company. And then in 1968, after just 2 summers here, the Tilletts moved on to other things. And Andy Oates, who was the master weaver from the very beginning, and his partner Bill Euler bought the weaving business and made Nantucket Looms, Inc. which still continues today, doing interior fabrics. They were doing commissions for interior design, developing these iconic products like the CPO jacket that's made of their tweeds, and then building up the store, which really took off with Liz Winship in the 1970s, who developed this Nantucket look. And then the company continues today under Bess Clark, Becky Perriner, and Stephanie Hall, and does interior design as well. So this is one of those incredible Nantucket businesses that has been going on and successful for over 50 years now. And you can see much more about them in the gallery as well. And then other Nantucket brands, throughout the 20th century, really just reflecting what this island is all about now. What is the identity of this place? Whether that's the summer resort community and these really funky pants that were sold at Stinchfield's in the 60s, or reflecting the landscape using specific landmarks like the Sankaty Lighthouse on the Nan of Nantucket children's wear, nods to whaling history. The CPO jacket that you saw earlier has ivory buttons, so really a nod to whaling, as well as just this tradition of handcraft and kind of looking at historical techniques. So the Nantucket designs for children often used hand smocking or lace collars and kind of historically inspired designs. And then capping off the exhibition, I'm very excited to be able to feature 3 contemporary textile makers who are incorporating sustainable practices into their work. Angel Evering of Two Hearts Creations used what she calls rescued textiles that would have been thrown out. Karen Shepard, who I see in the audience, does these wonderful Nantucket Mall mats, and we were so excited to commission her for one made of Nantucket Reds. And Cara DeHart making upcycled baby booties and toys from sweaters, and this beautiful shawl from loom waste. And I don't know, I think I'm probably going over time, but quick sort of just intro into what goes into making an exhibition like this. So since my time at the NHA, since I left, I have specialized specifically in costume mounting, and now that is what I primarily do as an independent contractor with my business. And costume mounting is basically building whatever is underneath the clothing to make it look how it's supposed to look. And that's both to keep it safe and supported, so the conservation side, using archival materials to make sure that these things are not going to be damaged or stressed, being on display for several months at a time. But also, it's a balance between conservation and curatorial and interpretive work, because clothing, you can't just put it on a wall like a painting. You really need to know what it's supposed to look like, to know what you need to make to support it, and customize mounts so that it's the proper historic silhouette, but also making choices on how you want these things to be interpreted. Is it a full mannequin display? Is it a dress form? So most of these costume mounts, starting with a dress form or mannequin, and then carving down and or padding out to get the right silhouette, and then giving things like hoop skirts so that it looks historically accurate. So you can see on the left, this is what the dress would have looked like without a hoop skirt. And then this is what it looks like after proper costume mounting. And since I chose to use dress forms, since we're really focusing on the pieces themselves, and contemporary mannequins don't really work with 19th century typically, I also made little arms for all of the dress forms, including little baby arms for the christening gown, which I thought was very fun, little arm nubs. So everything that you see up there, there's all sorts of hidden stuff going on underneath. This Nantucket High School girls' basketball uniform, which is a skirt and little bloomers, I started mounting, and I often do visual research to make sure, I know how it was supposed to fit, how tight were they wearing these, and I learned that this was actually worn with a shirt underneath, which we did not have as part of the donations, so we got a prop shirt so that it would be represented accurately. And this was switched very shortly after the date of this uniform, so women didn't have to wear these just a couple years later. And then in our 20th century section, I really wanted to highlight the garments themselves, and since a lot of them were single pieces, a pair of pants, a shirt, and had these great labels, I wanted to feature that. So I made custom invisible mounts out of phosphates, which is this really great material that shrinks and hardens with heat, and you can make these custom mounts. And there's actually a video on our on the NHA's social media about kind of what that process looks like. That was a really fun project to pursue on this exhibition. And I have many people that I have to thank. Of course, Michael Harrison for bringing me on in the first place and then bringing me back for the inventory and for working on this exhibition all these years later. Deborah Sorensen, who helped me, worked very closely working with me on the show, developing the concepts, research, interactives. Devin Kirby, who helped me with costume mounting and was our collections manager during install, and is collections manager at the NHA. And Jeremy Slavitz, the whole facilities team, Joe, Mark, Ken, building all the platforms and many mounts, Kurt Weidman and Helen Reigel, our exhibition and graphic designers. Rachel Mudrovsky did some painting conservation, and we had a number of textile conservators, Chris Knosson, Renee Walker-Tuttle, and Textile Conservation Workshop, who did some beautiful work for this show. And it really takes a team to put on something of this scale and an exhibition like this. So I have a lot of gratitude to everyone involved. I think we're ready for questions. And I think they're going to come around with a microphone for the questions.
Hi, I had a question about Nantucket Reds.
Mm-hmm.
I've also heard Martha's Vineyard has a claim on the red clothing too. I don't know if you know anything about that.
So I don't know about the Martha's Vineyard story. I do know that Murray's Nantucket Reds are from Nantucket. Murray's is one of the longest-running businesses on island, and the Nantucket Reds came out, and it's on the label, and I'm like forgetting the exact date, but several decades now, Nantucket Reds have been a Murray's exclusive specialty. So I don't know if they have another company, or if Vineyard Vines is making a similar color.
I heard from someone else, they said, oh, Martha's Vineyard is the originator of this red thing. I'm like, I didn't think so, but I heard some rumor, so.
Well, they're definitely not the originator of what we call Nantucket Reds, because that's what they're called.
I guess there was a Martha's Vineyard Red. I don't know. Someone's telling me that.
There's an avenue for future research, right? Oh, can you speak into the microphone, Karen?
I think they opened a satellite shop over there like a few years ago.
Okay.
So that could be why maybe they're selling Nantucket Reds on Martha's Vineyard, maybe. Murray's Nantucket Murray's Toggery, I think. Not anymore. But maybe that could be why that there was another one.
That sounds like an interesting avenue for use. I can say the inspiration for the Reds came from sails off the coast of Brittany, France. And that's where that like wind-worn, faded red color was inspired from. And speaking, what I can say in Martha's Vineyard, it is interesting when you look at retailing in the 20th century in these resort locations, because the Stinchfield, the funky checked pants we had, Stinchfield's labels, like the clothing label inside the pants says Stinchfield, Nantucket, Edgartown, Palm Beach. So Edgartown being on Martha's Vineyard. So there's definitely, crossover in some of these retailers in the 20th century being in these similar island resort locations. Yeah. Any other questions?
So you showed pictures of the bustle dress
Yes.
that we weren't able to use. Could you just go over briefly what some of the factors were in deciding that that wasn't something we could exhibit?
Sure. So the biggest factor is condition. And some pieces had condition. Many pieces have condition issues. Clothing and textiles. Textiles degrade. They're not made to last forever. And a lot of what we do in caring for collections is trying to just slow down that degradation process as much as possible through not creating chemical reactions with certain materials and giving a stable climate for things to be stored in. But that said, some pieces we had conserved and were really, really important to the history of Nantucket and to the collection, and were worth, budgeting conservation funds for. The bustle dress in particular, there was a big tear on one side, and it's 3 parts, so some of the parts were more intact than the other. There were tears in a few different places. So if one wanted to put it on display, that you could do a conservation treatment to make it mountable. The other consideration was, is this worth doing that for? And that dress in particular it doesn't have as strong of provenance as some of the other pieces do, so we don't know who wore it. We don't know exactly, we know that it was given to the NHA and it was presumably worn by someone on Nantucket. But we don't know much more than that, so it was not as strong of an argument to invest, time and funds into making that displayable, especially when we had other pieces that told a similar story that we could put on display.
Touched on this, but if you're handling a 200-year-old dress, which is some of those dates indicated, I conjure up this fragile garment. And meanwhile, you're mounting them. So 200 years later, how fragile are they? I mean, can you really mount them and not worry about damage?
That's a really good question. Every conservation-related question, the answer is it depends, which is not really a real answer. So yes, historic textiles are fragile to some extent. Some are not as fragile as you would expect. So it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the fiber that it's made out of. So old cotton and linen are actually quite sturdy. It depends on how it's been stored in those 200 years. Did the owner put it in the bottom of a wooden chest and now it's been, exposed to the wood acid and has browned and is degrading? Then you're going to have more problems with handling and condition than if it was stored in archival tissue, or even sometimes non-archival containers, but in a stable environment. So that has a lot to do with it, is what has happened to this object in 200 years? Are there sweat stains? Because the sweat stains are going to cause tear and degradation more than if they weren't there. But the other part of this is having the training in handling these objects and knowing how to kind of assess them, and like with Mike's question, kind of gauging what is safe to put on display and what isn't. There are definitely plenty of things in the show that aren't structurally stable enough to put on a form, but then there's also what are we putting underneath, right? So padding out the torso, giving it that supportive hoop skirt so that it is supported throughout the time that it's going to be on display. I could go on and on about this, but my last little tidbit I will say, so historic textile-wise, and what is fragile, and this I think is true about paper as well, which I'm not an expert on, but it's surprising to learn that sometimes older textiles, like 200, even 300-year-old textiles, are sometimes more stable than something from the 1920s or 1900s, because the way that they were dyeing and processing fabrics was different. So there's this era, at the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, when they were weighting silks with iron mordants to make them heavier. Or maybe it was a little bit, not quite at the end of the 19th century, but maybe 1880s. And this process was to make the the fabric heavier because it was sold by weight, but it actually introduces this material that actively degrades the fabric faster. So you'll get these fabrics, these silks in particular, that are shattering into pieces, and then you'll have something from 100 years earlier that's totally fine. So it's a lot of chemical reactions, and yeah. More than answered that, I think.
I was just wondering if you could give us a sense of how many items are just grand total of what you store, maybe how many are here.
Sure.
A numbers game.
Yeah. So when we did the inventory, I think we calculated it's about 2,000 pieces, and that includes, little tiny things and big full dresses. So that's how much is in storage. In the exhibition, we have, I think it's landed at about 170 pieces. And that also includes like sewing tools and little things that aren't textiles per se, but are used for making textiles. So typically, there's way more in storage than there is on display, especially when it comes to textiles. They can't be on display for very long because of light sensitivity and just these conservation concerns that we've been talking about. So it's, usually probably less than 10%, if that even, that's on display in a museum compared to what they have in the collection. Does Mike have something to add to that?
I just wanted to throw in, because you're quite right on the numbers. The costume and textile collection is the second largest artifact collection the NHA holds. So you think we're about whaling, which we are, but in terms of whaling artifacts, we maybe have 500 or fewer. We've got 2,000 costume and textile artifacts. The only collection of artifacts that's bigger is archaeology, which we think is about 5,000. So one of the reasons we did all of this work and brought Jennifer in originally was there's this enormous collection we're not using. We don't know what's in it. We don't know how it's valuable or useful or what it says about Nantucket. It's just taking up space. And what we've done is transform it into a collection that we can actually use, that tells real stories. We can lay our hands on the material. We know which pieces are safe and which pieces aren't safe. And we can do fantastic shows like the one that's going to open Thursday that we hope you all come to.
Yes, exactly. Do we have any other questions?
First, great talk.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Deborah.
I just, knowing how many objects are up there and how great they are, just share a couple favorites just for people to look for. I know that's the worst question to ask, but I know that there are many favorites and you've shared a lot, but just some Easter eggs for folks to look for.
That's a great question. I have new favorite objects. They're all, I love all, we picked them to be in the show for a reason. Okay. I'm gonna do one old and one new. So one of my favorites, and actually, well, you saw it in the slide. I don't know if I can go. I love the bodice from Paris. It's just such a beautiful example of craftsmanship, and it's this incredible moire fabric that when the light hits it a certain way, it's just so rich and beautiful. So the clothing maker I sew, so the maker in me just gets so excited over that piece. And the fact that it had this little handwritten note from the family. It's like, this was brought back from Paris in 1833. So I love that piece. I think it's, people could overlook it because it's just the bodice and we have it laying flat because of those conservation concerns. My other favorites, the whole craft revivals case that looks at the history of Nantucket looms and being able to feature a lot of these pieces that Julie Stackpole donated. It really begs very close looking, which I think, I've talked about this a lot in the talk, that, just digging in deep to what are the details behind these pieces. The Tillets in particular, they did hand screen printing and they loved to experiment, and they also loved for that handwork to be visible. So I have a specific spot of a specific textile that's my favorite because you can see where they were used. There are 5 different colored screens that they used on this one textile to create this. It's the big floral wildflower piece, and there's this one little bud that's on the top when you see it on display that shows the overlap of about 4 different color screens, and you can see how they're mixing color and playing with it, and they don't line up quite exactly, so you can get that little edge of a different color. Yeah, I love that piece.
Any other questions? All right. Well, that was such a lovely
Jocelyn.
preview of what you all will be able to see upstairs in the Coslin Gallery as of the end of this week. So we hope you do come back to check out the exhibition. I just want to share that our next exhibition-related lecture will take place next month on the 24th. Our Verney Research Fellow, who will be visiting the island conducting research, Rebecca Tolley, will be talking about embroidery education on the island. So please do join us for that. And thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Come back and see the exhibition when it opens.